Over the past 15 years, underage drinking has gone down by more than 40%, largely because the prevention system in Wyoming has succeeded in changing the culture around kids and alcohol.
Since 2001, underage drinking has decreased in the state of Wyoming from around 55% to now 31% for 30-day use.
I think the problem with underage drinking in Johnson County, very similar to most of Wyoming, was primarily cultural and acceptance, the rite of passage.
I think the problem was real prevalent. I think that we had parents who bought kegs of beer for kids as a rite of passage for events like proms and graduations.
I think the main problem was that we didn't know we had a problem. And if we did have a problem, we definitely didn't know what it was or how to remedy it.
And people measured their trips by how many six-packs it would take to get from town to town.
Most of the prevention that was being done in Wyoming during the 90s was through the block grant, the Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Block Grant provided to the counties. The counties were primarily funded through their mental health agencies within the county. They were providing programs. They were doing the best they could given the information that they had.
When I was hired as a substance abuse prevention specialist, they hired a coordinator for the mental health centers. Money was put through the grant to the mental health center, so they had a prevention specialist or some kind of prevention for each county.
We had a high country behavioral health working with a group of high school students about addictions, but it was, too much time on video games. It wasn't focused to underage drink. It wasn't alcohol, it wasn't anything really.
You would be invited by a local school and you would do a presentation on smoking related issues, and you would bring in the black lung and talk about the dangers to the body and why you should not start smoking and things like that.
When I think about underage prevention 10 plus years ago, it was very much educating parents on what underage drinking meant.
Prevention was this little pocket you did, and you just did what you thought would work in those areas.
Well, prevention in the 90s was more doing awareness, giving people information about drugs and what they looked like. And alcohol was really not a big focus of that prevention because it was everybody put their eyes on the scary illegal drugs.
When I first started, there was not any such thing as best practice programs for prevention. You just did what you thought might work.
The thought was if you scare kids and you show them what could happen, they're not going to do it.
Let's talk about something that's a real brain twister. Drugs. We try to do it. We try best. Drugs.
This is crack, rock cocaine.
So back in the early 90s, there was not a lot of information about what are the reasons why substance abuse occurs in the first place. And so there was a lot of research done out of the University of Washington, other places through Drs. Hawkins and Catalana with the Social Development Research Group around what are the risk and protective factors. The risk factors being those conditions in a community and within an individual's life that encourages them or promotes them becoming involved with substance abuse, and protective factors protect them or buffer young people's exposure to these risk factors and protect them from getting involved with substance abuse. There was not statewide data and also data available at the community level for community coalitions to make decisions. And so there was again, when you think about it, there was a lack of research on what works in prevention, a lack of information about what data tells us about the extent of the problem, what the risk protective factors look like in a community. So what happened in 2000, 2001? In some sense, it was a perfect storm for prevention in Wyoming. First is that the state legislature recognized the need to address substance abuse, so they formed the Substance Abuse Division. Another piece that fed into the development of prevention in Wyoming was the initiation of the state incentive grant. And here's where the federal government provided discretionary funds to each of the states, and the states were using those funds to be able to work with communities to identify evidence-based programs and strategies to put in place in those communities.
I remember my supervisor saying, there's this new thing that's going to be coming down from the state about best practice programs and prevention needs assessment. I think you should go to Cheyenne. They're going to be having a meeting. This grant would be coming down, the state incentive grant, and so you would be able to use the assessment to, help you decide what programs that would benefit your community.
At the same time, the Department of Education was receiving funding called the 21st Century Schools Grant. The intention of those federal funding was to work with schools to do the similar things that the Substance Abuse Division was doing, was how can we make the schools a place, an environment where young people could learn and they were not impeded by alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use among the students. In 2001, there was very unfortunately an incident where several members of the University of Wyoming cross-country team were killed on their way back from a cross-country meet by a drunk driver. And so being a small state, that impacted a lot of people throughout the state, and the legislature recognized that, hey, we do have a problem not only with underage drinking, but with adult drinking as well, and with drinking and driving. What we did was we provided training to members of each county so they could form a coalition.
Well, when the 21 SIG came, we were able to look at data that showed us what the risk factors were that led to kids becoming involved with drinking and drugs. Looked at those risk factors, looked at some best practice programs that were shown to reduce those risk factors, and with these community coalitions that were interested in reducing these things, we were able to pick some programs and introduce them into our communities.
The 21st Century State Incentive Grant was different than anything we had tried or done before, because it wasn't based on what felt right or just passing out information, but it was really based on evidence-based strategies and getting programs into schools that we knew worked. When the Strategic Prevention Framework State Incentive Grant, or the SPIF-SIG, came along, it changed everything, because it was really based on a public health model, and it changed who we focused on and the population we were trying to change, and it really broadened and expanded what we knew about prevention and what we were doing in Wyoming.
And what the Strategic Prevention State Incentive Grant, or SPIF-SIG, really allowed coalitions to do was to really look through a thoughtful process, as they had done in the past, but identify what strategies, both individual strategies and these environmental community-wide strategies, we could put in place. So when the SPIF-SIG came out, the communities in Wyoming, because of the work that had previously been done, were able to hit the road running and be able to work with the coalitions and identify what strategies will work best for our communities.
The public health model that the SPIF was based on is really this planning model that starts with needs assessment, moves to mobilizing and building capacity in your communities, writing a plan, implementing that plan, and then evaluating that plan. So it was a 5-step process where you assess your needs, mobilize people, have those people write a plan, implement it, and evaluate it. And while you're doing that, you think about the whole time, you think about sustainability and the cultural competence of where you're working.
Moving into public health, though, there was much more of a recognition, at least at the governmental level, of the work that we were doing and the acceptance of the changes that we were making, because we were already using a public health model.
What the public health model did was it changed who we were trying to change. No longer were we trying to change Bobby and Tommy and Susie and Timmy in a program, but we were trying to change whole communities. We were trying to change Laramie and Casper and Carbon County and Teton County and Rock Springs and Cheyenne. So we were trying to change giant populations, not just individuals and programs.
When I started working, a lot of it was just in the transition phase between the 21 SIG to the SPIF SIG, so going from programs in schools, really working individually with children, to much more of an environmental-based process that was much more related to public health.
It actually was a scientific model that we were able to dig our teeth into and work towards.
And again, that data component, nobody, even public health, they had seen the data, but they didn't know how to apply it. And so we started saying, obviously, this is data of our people. And the most common thing I think Suzanne and I kept hearing was, well, how do we know it's true and accurate? People just say whatever on a survey or when they're asked a questionnaire, you don't know if you really believe it. But it kept being the same data every single time. So we said, what if it's true? We'd be crazy not to go with it, and let's just see what we can make from it. Once the SPIF SIG came, we had a plan. We knew where we wanted to go, and we talked about in a perfect world, what would we see? And that was kind of our long-term goals of, okay, so then that's what we want to get to.
Well, the SPIF SIG really refined some things for us because programs were, we were with programs, with best practice programs, we were targeting individual factors, but on a broader scale, we needed to do more that would target the whole population. And so the SPIF SIG brought us into applying environmental strategies that involved some policy change and some community level change that had a broader impact than what the programs did.
Some of these examples of environmental strategies and environmental changes might be training retailers to check for fake IDs and to not sell to youth who come into their bar or restaurant or liquor store. Changing community events so that they're alcohol free, so youth don't see that alcohol is part of celebrations, or media campaigns that teach of the dangers of alcohol and things like that.
We started with some of the checklist and what could we do for outdoor events and public events with alcohol. We needed to make sure that our schools were on board with policies at the schools. When we first started with SPIF SIG 12 years ago, there was nothing in our handbook about alcohol on premises, which was just kind of a no-brainer. But without it, there was no teeth.
Doing compliance checks within the different establishments that sell alcohol, and then being involved with community events and working closely. We always have a police presence to help keep the function safe.
Chief Carter and I were TIPS trained, and we started TIPS trainings, not for the first time in Buffalo. Actually, this was kind of the second attempt at TIPS trainings in Buffalo. The first attempt, no one participated. No one wanted to participate. And so these TIPS trainings, training and intervention procedures to address underage drinking as well as adult overconsumption, we started with just building relationships with the retailers. In addition to that, we also rolled out compliance checks, not quite simultaneously, but pretty close in the same time frame for alcohol. And historically, in Buffalo and Johnson County, we had an 80% fail rate. So only 20% of the retailers at that time, prior to us rolling out TIPS trainings, were passing the compliance checks. So it worked really beautifully in, hey, you know, a lot of you are failing these compliance checks, you're getting fines, you're getting in trouble, here's what we're willing to do to help you with a solution by offering these trainings where you can check IDs and do all these things. And the folks got on board in a hurry.
Everybody wanted to do something different, but when we came together as a coalition and did comprehensive strategies, so we were doing programming, we were doing policy change, we were doing education, we're doing media, everybody could see the good side of working together and being partners in a comprehensive approach.
And when our local coalition prioritized social availability as the #1 by far causal area, which leads to underage drinking, they determined that the best thing that we could do is approach Buffalo City Council and look at a social host ordinance that would be more restrictive and more impactful than a Wyoming state statute. Probably the highlight of some of these city council meetings was when a high school senior at that time stood in front of city council, and the one council person who I will say was against the ordinance asked this high school senior, "So you're telling me that these parties happen?" And the high school senior responded by saying, "I could get on my phone right now, I could make a few calls and tell you about 6 house parties this weekend in Buffalo."
So in 2008, we had a group of students that contacted me and said that they thought something was screwed up. And so I said, talk to me about it. So we met in my office, and I thought we were talking 2 or 3 kids, and I think probably 17 or 18 kids came into my office. So I said, okay, new office area, we need to meet somewhere else. And we found a boardroom that was open, and they talked about how they think it's just ridiculous that drive-through liquor windows occur, that we even have them. And so I asked them what they wanted to do about it, and they said, we want to close them all down. And I said, so let's do it. And we presented, and it passed in 3 easy readings. And so we banned all liquor windows. We did have some people upset. They thought it would hurt their sales. But in reality, it really didn't.
When they started thinking about what would a community event where alcohol is served look to be safer and would be a community event where we can prevent, not just reduce, but prevent underage drinking, they very quickly got on board with things like IDing everyone, with having the wristbands, with cup sizes not being more than 12 ounces and only 2 beers being sold at a time. All those alcohol restrictions at community events that not just affect underage drinking, but hopefully have a positive impact on adult overconsumption as well.
Feels like people are on board, that they understand that it's not that we're saying no to alcohol, but we're saying no to underage individuals, and we're saying no to binge drinking. We're being more responsible.
When the SPIF-SIG ended, our discretionary funding from the federal government went way down, and we lost about 2/3 of our prevention funding in Wyoming. But it didn't change the fact that the coalitions were still working on it, or that many of the changes they had implemented over time and the cultures that have changed didn't change as well. So we lost some of our funding, but a lot of what we had done was sustainable, and a lot of the cultural change continued, and that's why we saw underage drinking continue to go down until we got some more discretionary funding.
You know, oftentimes I think in prevention, we tie success to funding, and certainly funding helps, but it doesn't have to be that way. We call that sustainability, I think, right? And so ultimately, even in lean years, again, the key being that the people take ownership of it, the community, and that's what Buffalo is. It's a community that cares. When you have those folks working collectively and collaboratively together, then the work continues.
The lasting impact at a local level was really a shift in attitudes and acceptance around underage drinking. We saw law enforcement, parents, elected officials really understand the consequences of underage drinking and want to continue this work around keeping kids away from alcohol. Really what we saw was a change from the 1990s, around 55% of youth reporting past month alcohol use, whereas today, roughly 30% or even lower in many communities, reporting past month alcohol use. So a big shift from the majority of youth using in the 90s to only 30%, less than a third of youth using today.
So as we started moving forward with this, we also saw underage drinking rates start gradually coming down, but then rather significantly through a lot of these efforts. I mean, I think we had a decrease of about 40% when we looked at the P&A data for underage drinking, for 30-day use as well as for binge drinking. For me, the bigger cultural change was all about relationships. You're surprised I would bring relationships up, right? But the relationship between prevention work with law enforcement, with retailers, with bar owners to simply say, hey, we're on the same page, let's work together. No one wants underage drinking happening. No retailer would tell you that they knowingly would want to sell to someone underage. And over the course of time, these relationships have built to a place where now in 2016, the retailers call me for tips trainings. We don't have a mandatory responsible beverage service ordinance in Buffalo. We don't need a mandatory responsible beverage service training in Buffalo because people do it willingly.
There's not an animosity role there. It's more of a corporate, you care, we care, let's do this together. Wyoming is known for its alcohol consumption anyway, but as far as our community and the consumption of alcohol among minors, I have seen, I'm not saying that they still don't do it, but we have seen a lot less of that, and we've seen a lot less accidents and tragedies as a result of that as well.
From 2001 to probably 2010 especially, we did see our underage drinking rates drop.
Culturally, in Wyoming communities, what we've seen is a real shift to no longer an acceptance of underage drinking, but really people, parents, and even youth and law enforcement coalitions really working to decrease underage drinking because they understand the consequences of it, and it's no longer okay to give kids alcohol or to just let kids use alcohol because, oh, it's just part of youth. We understand that there are consequences, and people have worked hard to really shift the culture around that acceptance.
The culture around underage drinking has changed, and this might be an oversimplification, from tacit acceptance, sweep it under the rug, rite of passage, to it's something that we talk about, it's something that in community we think very proactively about, and still have a lot of work to do as well. It's no longer a taboo subject. Well, I would credit the Spiff Sig years with really getting prevention off the ground and probably in a broader brushstroke, really bringing a heightened sense of understanding of the nature of prevention in individual communities' minds. That this is the effect of prevention over the course of time with this one community event, from a drunken brawl where you wouldn't want to take your kids, to a family-oriented affair where you do want to take your kids for great food, for fellowship, for good music, for face painting and bouncy houses and all those kinds of things that families enjoy. That's a shift in culture. That's ultimately, in my opinion at least, what our ultimate goal for prevention is.
I'm really excited that I've seen those changes. I've seen a community norm shift. I've seen in the process of the programs and the environmental strategies that the level of awareness that has happened with implementing those things has changed the norm, that everything we do involves alcohol, that it's changed the norm that public intoxication is not socially acceptable. It's changed the norm that adults don't purchase kegs of beer for kids as a rite of passage at their graduation. I've seen that change. I've seen, and we've also been able to see with the data that underage drinking has gone down, that kids are doing better, that kids are making better choices and feel more community support for that.
The culture has most definitely changed, not only with the servers. I actually think the patrons their culture has changed too. I mean, we have a chili cook-off that used to just smell of chili and beer and the stench. You'd walk in the parking lot and you could smell it, and you knew that people were getting drunk and eating lots of chili, and it just wasn't pleasant. And now actually you can hear the music. It's like you get rid of some of that stench and you can actually hear the music and you can see people and greet people. It's not all about the alcohol. There's still a lot about the chili, but we have so many family-friendly events now, whereas before that was never a thought. So now if there will be alcohol, it's partitioned off or it's labeled or people can go there. Data, our numbers look better.
I think the future of prevention really is the enhancement of a system that is capable of taking on more and above and beyond just even substance abuse, and looking at the integration of health impacts and disparities throughout the state of Wyoming.
Wyoming's prevention system continues to be driven by data, what we know works, and local communities focusing on why their problems exist and using the best environmental strategies, individual programs aimed at addressing those causes. Our prevention system continues to be science-based and continues to use the best sorts of prevention that we know how.
I see the future prevention is really along the lines that we've been talking about. It's using good data to drive our decisions. That's where the prevention needs assessment is so critical to the work that we do. We need to know data, what's working, what's not working, what are the areas we need to focus on. I think we're always getting smarter using research about evidence-based strategies and practices. So we're learning what works as new drugs come to the forefront, marijuana, whether it's Oxycontin or prescription drugs, we can apply what we've learned through alcohol and tobacco to these new drugs. In order to be successful, we know that prevention, we just don't do it once. We don't just brush our teeth once. Prevention must continue. So we're learning how to create and develop sustainable coalitions that will continue and be able to do their work beyond any one or two given funding streams.
So I think the future of prevention is just more communication and more people on board, because our coalition isn't just that 8 or 12. We now have hundreds and thousands of people that come and support. When we have a speaker to come talk about various subjects, we fill the auditorium. And 12, 13 years ago, we had the First Lady come and we had 9 people. I mean, so it's definitely more people are feeling it's okay to talk about, and they're more engaged.
The future of prevention in Johnson County, I think, is really bright and has a multitude of opportunities before it. The community as a whole really is on board and on the same page when it comes to prevention. And so these young families who have chosen Buffalo to raise their kids, they're invested. They're invested in prevention, and they're invested in what's best for their kids regarding underage drinking.
I see nothing but greater success. I see that you know, if we aren't going to, but if we were to stop now, I could see us regress. I would say any community that isn't doing it, it is well worth the time and the effort, because it will make a positive difference, as it did for us.
The prevention system in Wyoming has contributed to a more than 40% decrease in underage drinking, but there is still more work to do. Nearly a third of high school students still have alcohol every month, right? And our prevention system is challenged by budget cuts to our schools, budget cuts to the prevention system itself. What we need to do is continue to empower our communities, continue to empower our coalitions to do the best prevention they can, because what we know is that prevention in Wyoming works.